Thanks for joining us. My name is Brian Shaner. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for the public sector here at Dun Bradstreet. Joining me today is Amber Jaycock. She is the Vice President for Data and Analytics for the public sector. Hey, Amber, how are you doing?
Good, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, hey, look, I'm excited. This is our, unfortunately, this data brief series about how shipping data reveals supply chain weaknesses. And what's really been intriguing to me is the timeliness of these topics, because we've talked, when we started this back in September 1, there was like 34, 36 ships on the coast of California waiting to be processed. And the last article I saw, I think there's over 100 now waiting between California and China to get processed. And really, there's just not enough people and containers on both sides to make everything happen. And so really looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, it's
Um,
quite remarkable, I would say, Brian. I think that just in general, when we think about global trade and international business, all of these interconnected industries, the effects that we see from these shipments have a lot of downstream effects and ripple effects through the economy. But when we really think about that, approximately 90% of our trade volume is actually represented by maritime transport, we can just imagine that every time we see an additional ship on that coast or we hear about it, that delay or that risk that may be present in another company coming forward.
yeah, it's been interesting, and I think that when we looked at everything we've talked about so far, it's been pretty much this has happened. Here's the impact, and it's been on a global scale, or it's the impact has been pretty I would call it maybe shared across the chain, and everybody can see, oh, this has happened. Now we have a delay. But today, what we're going to talk about is actually the anomalies. And I think one of the things that we'd like to talk about and just ask you first, when we talk about the anomalies in maritime activity, what else might we be talking about?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Brian. And in general, there's a saying that I remember reading that kind of the financial metrics of a company demonstrate what the company has done. Whereas when we think about the shipping, it's what is happening now. So it is a little bit of, can be forward looking in the right context. But when we talk about anomalies, context really matters. And I'd say it literally matters because you can only identify an anomaly given some set of context. So when we think about these anomalies here, many people would often describe an anomaly as something that deviates from an expected norm or some anticipated behavior. However, I think it's really important to also consider an anomaly that might represent something entirely new that we've never seen before or we may not expect. So when we talk about, let's say, compliance or regulation, we may see people that are contributing to illicit activity in a way that we've never seen before. So we can't capture that with some norm. It is an outlier for which we have no previous knowledge. But when we actually think about these anomalies in shipping data, or when we think about transport or maritime or just maritime governance in general, these patterns and outliers can be considered from a number of perspectives. You can have, let's say, an individual vessel. In that point in time, an anomaly can occur. You can have it across a geographic dispersion. You can have it relative to its own history, the temporal component. You can also have it relative to a cluster or a group of other activities. These could be container distributions of goods. They could also be vessels. You can think about it in terms of routes, deviations from routes in terms of the actual location that they take in the path, or time. And time is one that when you mention those ships off the coast of Long Beach or within overseas in China, what we see there is actually these delays are a deviation from the expected time of arrival, or a deviation from being able to unload the ships given labor shortages. So I think when we just talk about anomalies, it's very important, as I said, to consider that context, but also how you're comparing it and the fact that an anomaly may be something that we have seen before, but it also may be something entirely new that we now want to pay attention to then think about future behavior.
It's really interesting. So one of the things that you and I talked about as we led up to this conversation is these automated systems and looking at how shipments are tracked to be able to identify those anomalies. Could you walk us through some of the steps that these systems are being set up for, or how people are finding these anomalies as soon as possible? Because I'm
Yeah.
assuming once they happen, you have to understand that there's going to be some effect or some ripple to potential risk I need to mitigate?
That's a wonderful question, Brian. And I think imagine if you now didn't have access to an online bank account, or you had to still, most people don't write as many checks, so manually balancing their checkbook. We also can think about the ability to detect and identify both that expected behavior and the anomalies, as well as the relationships between these in a way that is technology enabled. So as humans, just think we have a really difficult time of manually making sense of all of this data. Imagine the vast number, the 50,000 ships, all of the containers, all of the goods. We ourselves are going to have difficulty understanding what an anomaly is or what is expected. And so we tend to rely on both technology platforms, the analysis to surface this information, but also within the context of anomalies and vessels right now, there are two main components. So you have the AIS systems, or automatic identification systems, which are transponders on ships that allow us to track what those ships are doing. But it's not just tracking them, it's the behavior of that AIS system, perhaps when it's turned off, that might also indicate anomalous behavior or illicit activity. For example, imagine ships that are loitering off the coast, or they turn it off to make some illicit transfer of goods. The alternative to this, though, is also using UAVs or satellite imagery, which is becoming also common along with the AIS tracking. So within our data, we have the AIS tracking, but you also think of extracting that beyond the vessel level into the individual product level, which is the serialized code for those products. So now you're actually able to also understand the tracking over time of that serialized good across all waterborne shipments. And in some cases, often when it exits the waterborne, it may enter a ground transport system. So the combination of both these layers of the vessel and then the serialized give us a lot of power to understand the tracking and the behavior, as we discussed, to be able to identify the behavior that is anomalous, that we're looking for, or we're kind of trying to use to prioritize our attention. Imagine 50,000 ships, Brian, and
Yeah.
every single second they're pinging something. There's literally no way to do this, and you probably want to then be able to focus your resources and constraints.
Yeah, I
Given
mean,
constraints.
I can barely, binge watch a show, and I mean that's only 8 episodes, and you're talking 50,000 ships. I mean, that kind of thinks of what do they say? If you go to the Smithsonian and try to spend 1 second in front, it takes you 2 years to see everything or something.
Yeah, exactly.
That's crazy. All right, so that's really interesting. So now we have the systems helping us monitor, and we're identifying the anomalies.
Mhm.
What types of examples could you share with us that might be of interest here, around what the systems might kick out to us that we'd be looking for?
Yes, I think there are plenty of examples we can find in recent news, Brian. As you mentioned, just the disruptions from delays that exist off the coast. So this ability to not only measure the speed, but also the estimated time versus actual time of arrival. This all has to do with delays, which lead to operational disruption. That you also have the fact that in many areas there are regulatory or compliance requirements. So imagine one area where there's been a lot of activity around identifying anomalous behavior is in illegal fishing off certain coasts, and certain ships will end up turning off their tracking. But if we talk about actual goods, think about these ships as they then enter the ports. We talked about labor shortages that might exist. So now you know that when certain goods are not getting into the port and offloaded, the downstream effects that you will see in certain industries, being able to marry it with that data to understand potential future shortages is one of the powerful mechanisms of using this data combined with what I would say corporate or business level data like we have at Dun Bradstreet. I'm sure, Brian, you have a few other examples we can think of. I know we talked about one of the great examples of drilling down into the data with TSA, and maybe you want to highlight that one.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I know one of the things that we were able to do is using the business information along with the shipping information. We were able to identify that a company was actually trying to load missile parts onto an airplane, and that's one of the things that, when you look at what's in the container, because you can see that from the manifest and whatnot, but then you have to marry it back to the company. It's like, oh wait, they don't normally ship this type of equipment it raises a red flag, and you can, throw up the, hey, you should probably look at this, because those are so. And it's interesting because I know a lot of the times we've talked about this, we have been talking about the economic impact and the workforce impact of labor shortages, et cetera. There's other things that you can take action on as around protecting the environment or protecting your community from these types of activities, and alerting it. So it's really a powerful set of data that you're able to get here. I think one of the things that we talk about, and you brought up, is that this labor shortage. And I know there's a lot of activity that we've been doing around what's the economic impact around these different types of things, whether it's the COVID portal or whatnot. Could you just talk a little bit about, kind of expound on, great, now that I see a delay, what I might look at from an economic standpoint or from a workforce standpoint to really understand how it might actually impact me as my agency, or my tax base and whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I would say that in terms of when we actually think about these shortages, you can think about it from the macroeconomic perspective, like what's going to be the impact to, let's say, that county or the industry in terms of GDP or labor. And this is all about supply and demand. So if you still have the same demand, but your supply is contracted, that causes problems. And same way the other way. If, for example, you have an increase in supply and demand decreases, then that's the converse. So it's about pricing, which then ultimately affects cash flow of companies, which can in turn affect financial risk. So the same way when we say, like, you go from a raw material into a good, into a platform or a technology that then is transported in a container, in a ship that goes somewhere. All of these, just like in the economy, there are these ripple effects. We also see that in the supply chain. Now, if you go and you look at this as what an individual company might see, again, it goes back to that financial or the operational component. You may not be able to get your goods. You may have a delay. You may need to look at alternative procurement methods. You may need to reduce perhaps staffing to deal with the delay in goods, and then have it be more flexible throughout time. So from an individual corporation, depending how small or large you are, we all rely on goods. Brian, I don't know about you, but I probably can't think of a single thing that is sitting around me or on me that probably was produced just in the area that I live. And so we can imagine it's just all of the things that will affect our lives if, for example, we either have a labor shortage or, for example, there's congestion. So the combination of both is operational risk and then the financial risk married together really kind of can present challenges, but there are also efficiencies to be gained as well. And so I think that's another important point to just talk about, is that sometimes when we think about anomalies, we think about all the negative things that can occur from it, but there are also, I would say, beneficial aspects to, let's say, the public good that we can see from some of these anomalies.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As I've gone through this, and there's been a lot of very interesting factoids I've picked up during the conversations. And you're right. When I think about what's around me right now, but the only thing local that I know is produced is some groceries, because I go to the farmer's market. And so I'll grab some local vegetables. But the desk I'm on, the laptop I'm using, the pen I'm writing with, yeah, all that was probably on some ship sometime getting to me. And we just don't really think about those things. I think two other things that I want to ask about is, we talked with Julia last week, and she talked about the increase in shipping container prices, and the impacts this is having. As an agency, or as a kind of in the government side of things, and I'm looking at my workforce, and I'm looking at my economics, do you see that potentially some of these costs or these anomalies, can we start to articulate this anomaly might create this increase in price? And then I can start to understand, okay, great, I can start to hypothesize this anomaly, or an anomaly like this happens, might translate into this increase in price. Therefore, I can maybe predict some sort of economic or workforce impact from that. Are we heading in that direction?
In theory, Brian, if I had a crystal ball and everything worked perfectly, data was available and quality was great and coverage was ideal, the answer would probably be yes. But I think when we go down and we start to think about anomalous behavior, one of the things that generally policymakers or law enforcement or economic developers want to know is, what action can they take? What policy levers do they have at their disposal? You have the carrots, you have the sticks, but what can they actually do? And in order to understand that, you have to understand then what's driving the anomaly. I think that gets us back to a very important question or point here, which is the type of modeling that's used to underlie that anomaly detection. And it is why you often see rather rules-based or easily interpretable models applied in this space, even though we may be able to apply more accurate, nonlinear type of models to what we are predicting. This concept of being able to have a policymaker or decision maker go back to not only identifying the anomaly, but what's driving it so they can remediate it or mitigate future risk is something that is extremely important in any type of decision maker's toolbox.
So it's almost like they could make their policies and then start to pay attention to it to say, hey, let's change, I don't know, change hours of the port operates or the number of hours people can work in a port or whatever, then monitor for the anomalies behind the afterwards to see if the policy was actually having the intended consequence or impact or not, right? So
yeah,
they could,
exactly.
okay.
And I would also say, Brian, I'll go back to one point that you raised also about just the pricing with shipping containers and the shortage. So when we talk about supply and demand, there's clearly, maybe some people would claim an opportunity for price arbitrage there, but you can also look at where the pricing is more favorable and imagine that people are going to try to route those containers to those locations, which may then lead to a workforce development opportunity. These types of things, no matter, we all know if there are favorable pricing or favorable compensation in certain areas, people tend to gravitate, and will likely be no different for the shipping containers. Now, that being said, there's a lot of infrastructure around these. So it's not like just because there's one favorable pricing in one port, it's going to mean they're going to be able to accommodate all of that. On top of that, then you have the offloading of it, which is the labor, so the available labor force, as well as the distribution mechanisms once it gets off the ship. So thinking about the distribution centers, the warehouses, everything that has to go from getting it from the port to the place where you're producing the good from the raw material, and then from the good to the buyer, and all the things that happen in between based on that industry.
Oh yeah. All right. So yeah, for the attendees, if you have any questions for Amber, just pop them into the Q&A panel down there. Hey, Amber, I think it was that point you just made is probably something that you're right. I think a lot of the conversations we had has been on the ships are there, my stuff is going to be delayed, or what's the impact to me because I placed an order for these goods, or if I'm the Army and I placed an order for 50,000 uniforms and I've got 50,000 recruits starting, but that's going to be delayed 2 months. I've got to solve the problem, but what's the proactive piece? And I really like that part about when Julia was talking last week. She said that when you look at New York and Miami and Boston, right now they're importing, and so there's an imbalance between the ports that are importing a lot of stuff, whereas New Orleans actually has more of an export. So New Orleans could look at this and say, hey, look, we'll pay extra for these empty containers because we want to ship the goods out and get them out so that we don't build up this backlog here and all. So that's really interesting and something that we hadn't really discussed in the past.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to add, Brian, when you talked about New Orleans, it triggered a thought in my mind, something as we're very aware about Ida and natural disasters that can occur, and something that we sometimes see and where we have increased intensity in these natural disasters, or let's say areas where there's a lot of ice or melting. Some of these route deviations that we tend to see, or things that ships that are maybe at the first to see this, or products that are on a ship where there is maybe a delay, may not be a negative thing. They may be actually deviating to avoid some catastrophe, which is a collision or bad weather event, and which then can help the other vessels and the other goods that would normally follow that to take proactive behavior, so that in the end, actually, the supply chains are strengthened. So this is, I think, what I was mentioning in the very beginning about the converse of thinking about an anomaly as kind of having negative connotation. This is what, the positive benefit of identifying anomalies. So with that, Brian, shall we turn it over to questions? I think you froze for one moment.
Okay, so one of the other things is when you talk about data sources are critical to them. All right, am I back?
You're back, Brian. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
I was asking you about a question about data sources and methods. Did you happen to catch that one or no?
I did not. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I was just thinking as we're looking at the anomalies and trying to identify what data sources or methods do you all use to go through this?
Yes, so I'm not gonna, as you said, Brian, don't get into the technical autoencoders or the Markov random fields or things of that sort. So I'm not gonna go there, but I'll start with data sources first. The first is really on the vessel level. Obviously, we're using, we have the vessel information that has the tracking as well as the serialized codes that exist on the containers. So when we think about, let's say, the transport of goods, we've talked a lot, I think in the previous sessions about the container life cycle and the track and trace's ability to track a container from empty to empty and all of those events, the 60 or 70 events that exist between that. So that type of data at that level of granularity, when we're talking about delays and pinpointing where they are, they can be that granular or they can be rolled up to the macro level, where then at the macro level, we're looking at location specific data, or which might include, like, let's say things like weather or satellite data. On top of that, if we go to the individual companies, here at Dun Bradstreet, any of the financial risk or operational risk metrics that we have can be linked to that. So you could imagine the myriad of opportunities we have to answer questions from these different angles or the different levels of hierarchy, all the way from a port to the vessel to a company. These are all ways to address it.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to mention, Brian, I think you asked about the general methods that are used here. And I talked a little bit about that when we started, saying that many of these systems are built using expert systems, rules-based thresholds, linear models. We've not seen as much incorporation for at least the monitoring and the governance side in terms of deep learning models. But when we move over into being able to predict this, it is a lot about the relationships, so the network dynamics of it. But before we can even prescribe any type of outcome, which would be one of these models where you have a predefined event, we often don't know what that is. So many of the models that are used to identify these anomalies are what we know are called as unsupervised, where you're looking for structure in that data, and then you're looking for deviations from some type of structure, which might be a cluster of routes or a cluster of ships or a behavior. And so you are really then measuring some deviation or something that pops up that is unexpected, that doesn't fit into the threshold or the outline of the data that is described from what you've seen in the past.
No, that's real. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think when you look at it, I'm still stuck on the positive piece because we've been so focused on the negative impacts of the ships being delayed and all. And I think there's just so many opportunities that looking for these shouldn't be, oh my gosh, something's going wrong. It should just beg a question.
Yes.
This has happened. Why has it happened? And to your point, it could be better because maybe we've got ships avoiding the hurricane or the iceberg or the whatever it is or whatnot. So listen, so we're almost up at time right now. So this has been really insightful. Any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to make?
I'll make one comment, Brian, and I think I'll go back to the beginning. Thinking about anomalies should not only have a negative connotation, but positive, but also it should not only deviate from the norm, but look for the unexpected. And those unexpected, we can learn a lot from, such that if we're able to identify them, we're able to implement mechanisms and frameworks such that we can identify them in the future to make, whether it's supply chains or local economies, stronger, that can mitigate against future disruptions, which may be operational or financial.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Amber. And everybody, thanks for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll send out the recording. Thank you very much. Goodbye. See you,
Thanks
Amber.
so much, Brian. Have a great day. Thanks for having me.